Isaac Newton, one of the most brilliant minds who has ever lived, a man who calculated the precise motion of the planets and unlocked the mathematical laws of the entire physical universe, lost a fortune on the stock market, not through simple bad luck and not because the crucial information was somehow hidden from him, but because, in a moment of watching other people grow rich around him, he did something almost every human being does, something you have very likely done yourself, in some smaller way, without ever knowing it had a name. Tonight, we are going to trace the long, strange history of how the human mind actually meets money, and why even genius, even the genius that mapped the heavens, offers no protection at all against it. Because here is the quiet truth at the center of everything we will explore tonight. Think for a moment about the last time you spent money on something you did not really need. Not a catastrophe, nothing dramatic, just a small purchase, an upgrade, a treat, a thing that caught your eye. And now, think about how you felt an hour later or a day later. Perhaps a small flicker of regret, perhaps a quiet justification forming in your mind, a reason it was actually fine, perhaps nothing at all. Here is what is strange about that moment, the moment of spending, and the small story you told yourself afterward. It was almost certainly shaped by forces you were completely unaware of. Patterns of thought so deeply woven into the human mind that even the economists who spent their entire careers studying money failed for the better part of 2 centuries to account for them at all. The same forces that moved Newton moved you in that small moment, and they have moved every human being who has ever earned, spent, saved, or feared losing a single coin. It is a history full of unlikely characters. A Scottish gambler who nearly bankrupted an entire kingdom with a scheme built on paper and confidence. 2 friends in a small country arguing over every word of every sentence, who together overturned an assumption that had stood at the center of an entire field for 200 years. And running underneath all of it, quietly, in every era, ordinary people, people exactly like you, making the same small, predictable, deeply human mistakes with their money, again and again, across 4 centuries, without ever quite understanding why. This is not a story about foolishness. It is a story about what it actually means to be a human being with a mind and a wallet in a world that assumed, for a very long time, that we were something we never were. It is a story that ends, as we will see, not in judgment, but in something closer to compassion, a clearer and kinder understanding of the strange, beautiful, imperfect way the human mind actually meets the thing we call money. But let us start somewhere closer, right here, in the world you live in. At this moment, let us begin with the simplest possible version of the puzzle, and then slowly add the layers that make it genuinely fascinating. For most of the history of economics as a formal discipline, there was a quiet, foundational assumption sitting underneath nearly everything, that human beings, when it comes to money, are fundamentally rational, that we weigh costs against benefits, calculate our own best interest, and then act on that calculation in a reasonably consistent, logical way. Economists even gave this imagined creature a name, sometimes calling it homo economicus, economic man, a perfectly rational decision maker who always knows what he wants, always knows how much it is worth to him, and always chooses accordingly. This imagined creature had some very specific and demanding properties worth spelling out clearly, because seeing exactly what economists were assuming makes it much easier to see just how far it stands from any actual human being. Homo economicus was assumed to have perfectly consistent preferences, meaning that if he preferred one thing to a second and the second to a third, he would reliably prefer the first to the third, never contradicting himself. He was assumed to process all available information flawlessly, weighing every relevant fact without error or bias. He was assumed to be unaffected by how a choice happened to be described or presented, caring only about the underlying substance, never the surface framing. He was assumed to treat all his money identically, regardless of where it came from, and he was assumed to be perfectly consistent across time, valuing his future self's interests exactly as he valued his present self's, never sacrificing tomorrow for a fleeting pleasure today. Each of these assumptions, as we will see tonight, turns out to be systematically, demonstrably false when applied to actual human beings, and yet together they formed the bedrock on which an enormous amount of economic theory was quietly built. The trouble, as it turned out, is that this creature does not exist, not in you, not in me, not in anyone. Real human beings, when studied carefully, turn out to make financial decisions in ways that are systematically, predictably irrational, not randomly mistaken, which would average out over time, but consistently biased in particular directions, tilting the same way again and again, across cultures, across income levels, across levels of education and intelligence. And the field that eventually grew up to study these patterns, now usually called behavioral economics or the psychology of money, represents one of the more genuinely surprising intellectual revolutions of the last century. A slow, hard-won overturning of an assumption so basic that almost no one had thought to question it seriously for generations. It is worth being clear about why this matters and why it is more than an academic curiosity. The way we understand human financial behavior shapes an enormous range of real things. How governments design policies meant to help people save or spend or avoid harm. How businesses design the products and prices and choices they present to us. How we understand our own struggles and successes with money, and even how we judge ourselves and others. If we believe people are perfectly rational, we will design a world and tell ourselves a story. That assumes everyone can and should simply calculate their own best interest and act on it, and we will treat those who struggle as having failed at something anyone could easily do. If we understand, instead, that people are systematically, universally, and understandably biased, we will design a very different world and tell a very different and more compassionate story, one that accounts honestly for the minds we actually have. The shift we are tracing tonight is not merely a change in economic theory, it is a change in how we understand ourselves, with consequences that reach into policy, into commerce, and into the quiet judgments we make about our own financial lives, lying awake at night. Let us look at a few of these patterns before we trace where the understanding of them came from. Because once you see them, you will start to recognize them everywhere, including, quietly, in yourself. Consider what researchers call loss aversion, perhaps the single most important idea in this entire field. It turns out that the pain of losing a certain amount of money is, for most people, considerably more intense than the pleasure of gaining the exact same amount. Losing a given sum hurts roughly twice as much as gaining that same sum feels good, according to the research that first measured this carefully. This is not how a perfectly rational decision-maker would behave, since to such a creature, a gain and a loss of equal size should simply cancel out, weighed on the same neutral scale. But we are not built that way. we feel losses far more sharply than equivalent gains. And this single asymmetry, once you understand it, explains an enormous range of otherwise puzzling human financial behavior, from why people hold on to losing investments far too long, hoping to avoid crystallizing the painful loss, to why the fear of a downturn can grip a market far more powerfully than the prospect of an equivalent gain ever could. You can feel this asymmetry in your own experience if you pause to notice it. Imagine finding a sum of money on the street, a pleasant surprise, a small lift to your day. Now imagine losing that exact same sum, discovering it had fallen from your pocket somewhere along the way. For almost everyone, the imagined loss stings considerably more than the imagined gain delights, even though the amounts are identical. This is not a flaw in your particular character. It is a nearly universal feature of the human mind, and it quietly shapes an enormous number of financial decisions, often without our ever noticing its influence. It is why a guarantee against loss can feel so much more appealing than a chance at an equivalent gain. Why people will go to considerable lengths and sometimes take considerable risks, specifically to avoid locking in a loss they have already, in reality, suffered. Consider another pattern, sometimes called mental accounting. A perfectly rational person would treat all of their money as essentially interchangeable, since a given unit of currency is worth exactly the same regardless of where it came from or what mental category it happens to sit in. But real people do not treat money this way at all. We tend to sort our money into separate mental buckets, treating money we won unexpectedly, or received as a gift, or found in an old coat pocket, very differently from money we earned through careful work. Even though every unit is objectively identical in value and spending power. We might carefully budget our salary while cheerfully splurging a tax refund of the same size, as though the two sums were somehow made of different material. This is mental accounting at work, and it shapes far more of our financial behavior than most of us ever realize. It is why a windfall so often seems to evaporate on things we would never have bought with our regular income, and why we can hold savings earning very little interest in one mental account while carrying expensive debt in another, keeping the two carefully separated in our minds, even though a moment's rational reflection would tell us to bring them together. Consider a third pattern, called anchoring. When we are uncertain about the value of something, which is to say, in a great many real financial situations, our minds tend to grab onto whatever number happens to be nearby and use it as a reference point, an anchor, even when that number is completely arbitrary and logically irrelevant to the actual decision. A price tag showing a high original price next to a lower sale price makes the sale price feel like a bargain, precisely because the high anchor has quietly reshaped our sense of what the thing is worth. The anchor does not need to be accurate or fair or even relevant to exert its pull. It simply needs to be present and nearby at the moment we are trying to decide. Researchers have demonstrated this effect in genuinely startling ways, showing that even a completely random number generated in front of a person moments before they are asked to estimate the value of something entirely unrelated can measurably shift that estimate in the direction of the random number. The mind, faced with uncertainty, reaches for any available handhold, and having grasped one, quietly lets it shape everything that follows. Once you understand anchoring, you begin to see it deployed everywhere in the world of commerce, often quite deliberately. The suggested retail price printed on a product, considerably higher than any price the item is ever actually sold for, exists precisely to serve as an anchor, making the real price feel like a discount. The most expensive item on a menu is often placed there not because anyone expects to sell many of them, but because its high price makes everything else on the menu feel more reasonable by comparison. The first number named in a negotiation exerts a powerful pull on where the negotiation eventually settles, which is why skilled negotiators think carefully about who should name a figure first and what that figure should be. None of this requires the anchor to be honest or even plausible. It requires only that a number be present in your mind at the moment you are trying to judge value. And the mind, uncertain and reaching for something solid, does the rest, quietly and automatically, usually without our ever noticing it has happened at all. Consider a fourth pattern, called the endowment effect. It turns out that the moment we own something, we tend to value it more highly than we did before we owned it, often demanding considerably more money to give it up than we would ever have been willing to pay to acquire it in the first place. In careful experiments, people given a simple object, a mug, a pen, some small item of modest value, and then offered the chance to sell it, consistently demanded a price meaningfully higher than what an equivalent group of people who had not been given the object were willing to pay to buy the very same thing. Nothing about the object changed. The only difference was ownership, the simple fact of the thing being now mine. This is not how a rational actor would behave, since to such a creature, the value of a mug is the value of a mug, regardless of who happens to be holding it. But for real human beings, ownership itself alters value, wrapping whatever we possess in a subtle, additional layer of worth that exists only because it is ours. The endowment effect is, in a sense, loss aversion viewed from another angle, since giving up something we own registers psychologically as a loss, and losses hurt. It helps explain a great many everyday financial puzzles. Why people find it so hard to sell possessions for what the market will actually pay. Why we cling to belongings we never use. Why negotiations so often stall, as each side values what they hold more highly than the other side is willing to pay for it. It even helps explain certain sales techniques, such as free trial periods, which work in part precisely because once you have taken something home and begun to think of it as yours, giving it back begins to feel like a loss, and the loss-averse mind will pay to avoid that feeling. The moment of ownership, it turns out, is not a neutral fact, but a psychological event, one that quietly and reliably reshapes how much a thing is worth to us. Consider a fifth pattern, one of the most consequential of all for anyone trying to save for the future, sometimes called present bias or hyperbolic discounting. Human beings systematically and dramatically overvalue rewards available right now in the immediate present compared to rewards available in the future, even when the future reward is considerably larger. Offered a smaller sum today or a larger sum in a year, a great many people will take the smaller sum today, discounting the future reward far more steeply than any consistent, rational calculation would justify. This is the deep psychological root of why saving for retirement or for any distant goal feels so genuinely difficult, since the pleasure of spending now is vivid, immediate, and emotionally present, while the benefit of saving is abstract, distant, and belongs to a future self who can feel, strangely, like a different person entirely. Researchers have found, in fact, that when people think about their own future selves, the parts of the brain that activate look more like the parts that activate when thinking about a stranger than the parts that activate when thinking about oneself in the present. Your future self, the one who will need the retirement savings, can feel at the level of the brain almost like a different person. someone whose interests you are being asked to sacrifice for, rather than an extension of the very same you sitting here now. This helps explain why saving can feel so much like a genuine loss in the present, a sacrifice made on behalf of someone who does not quite feel real, and why so many of the most effective approaches to encouraging saving work precisely by making that future self feel more vivid, more present, more genuinely connected to the person making the decision today. Understanding this pattern does not make it disappear, but it does explain why the struggle to save is not a simple failure of willpower or character, but a predictable consequence of how the human mind weighs present against future across time, and even of how the brain itself represents the person we will one day become. Consider a sixth pattern called the sunk cost fallacy. Having already invested money, time, or effort into something, we feel a powerful pull to continue investing in it, even when doing so no longer makes any sense, purely because we cannot bear to see our earlier investment wasted. We sit through the rest of a film we are no longer enjoying because we paid for the ticket. We pour more money into a failing project because we have already poured so much in. We stay too long in ventures, commitments, and situations that no longer serve us, held in place by everything we have already put in, unable to accept that the past investment is gone, regardless of what we choose next. A perfectly rational actor would ignore sunk costs entirely, since money already spent is gone regardless of what we choose next, and only the future consequences of a decision should matter. But real human beings cling to their past investments, allowing money that is already gone and can never be recovered to distort decisions that should be made looking only forward. This bias, too, connects back to loss aversion, since abandoning something we have invested in means finally, definitively accepting the loss of that investment. An acceptance, the loss-averse mind will go to remarkable lengths to postpone. And consider a seventh pattern called herd behavior, which returns us to the crowds and bubbles we will explore in more detail shortly. Human beings are deeply social creatures, and when we are uncertain, we look to others to guide our own behavior, often assuming that if many people are doing something, they must know something we do not. In financial markets, this tendency can amplify itself into powerful, self-reinforcing waves, as rising prices draw in more buyers, whose buying pushes prices higher still, drawing in yet more buyers in a spiral driven not by any careful assessment of underlying value, but by the simple, powerful human instinct to follow the crowd. And consider one final pattern for now, called the framing effect, which we will return to later in a more historical context, because it lies at the very heart of the psychology of money. The framing effect describes how the exact same choice, presented or worded in two different but logically equivalent ways, can lead people to make completely different decisions. A medical treatment described as having a 90% survival rate feels very different from the same treatment described as having a 10% mortality rate, even though the two descriptions convey identical information. A financial product described in terms of what you might gain feels different from the same product described in terms of what you might lose. This is deeply unsettling from the standpoint of rationality, because it means our choices can be shaped, even reversed, not by any change in the underlying facts, but purely by how those facts happen to be presented to us. And it means, more practically, that anyone who controls how a choice is framed to you, a marketer, a salesperson, a government, a well-meaning employer, holds a subtle but real power over the decision you will make, whether or not they intend to use it, and whether or not you are aware it is happening. But to understand how we came to see these patterns and why it took so astonishingly long, we need to go back. Not because history is interesting for its own sake, though it very often is, but because the present on its own does not fully make sense without it. The assumption that human beings are fundamentally rational about money did not arise from careful observation of how people actually behave. It arose in large part because it made the mathematics of economics far more tractable. If you assume people are rational optimizers, you can model their behavior with elegant equations, predict market outcomes, and build a clean, self-consistent theoretical structure. The assumption was, in a sense, a convenience, a simplification, adopted partly because it made the resulting theory beautiful and workable, and only gradually, over a very long time, did the discipline confront just how much this convenient simplification was quietly leaving out. There is a deeper lesson here about how sciences develop and about the seductive power of a beautiful theory. A model that is elegant, mathematically tractable, and internally consistent exerts a powerful pull on the human mind, precisely the mind we have been discussing all evening. Quite apart from whether it happens to be true, the rational actor model was genuinely beautiful in the way that a well-constructed piece of mathematics is beautiful, and it allowed economists to prove theorems, build models, and make predictions with a rigor that felt satisfyingly scientific. To question it was to threaten this whole elegant edifice, to trade clean, provable results for messy, complicated, psychologically realistic ones that resisted neat mathematical treatment. It is genuinely understandable in this light that the discipline clung to the rational actor for as long as it did, and that the psychologists who eventually challenged it faced such resistance. They were not merely proposing a new finding. They were threatening to replace a beautiful, orderly world with a messy human one. And few things are harder, in any field, than giving up a theory whose elegance one has come to love. This is itself, in a sense, a demonstration of exactly the psychology the field would come to study. Even scientists, even brilliant ones, grow attached to their existing beliefs and resist information that threatens them. In ways that have little to do with cold, rational evaluation of evidence, it is worth pausing on a genuine irony here because it sits right at the foundation of the entire field. Adam Smith, the 18th century thinker usually credited as the founding father of modern economics, is remembered today primarily for his work describing markets, self-interest, and the famous invisible hand guiding economic activity. But Smith wrote another, earlier book, considerably less famous, called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which was a deep and subtle study of human psychology, of sympathy, of our concern for how others see us, of the many irrational and emotional forces that actually drive human behavior. Smith, in other words, understood perfectly well that human beings were not cold, rational calculating machines. He had written an entire book about exactly how emotional and psychologically complex we truly are. Some of Smith's observations in that earlier work read, remarkably, almost like anticipations of discoveries that would not be formally made for another 2 centuries. He wrote, for instance, about how the pain of losing something tends to exceed the pleasure of gaining something of equal value, describing an asymmetry strikingly close to the loss aversion that Kahneman and Tversky would rigorously measure some 250 years later. He wrote perceptively about how people are driven not merely by material self-interest, but by a deep desire for the approval and regard of others, by vanity, by the wish to be seen as worthy, He understood that human beings routinely act against their own long-term interest in pursuit of immediate feeling, that we are inconsistent, emotional, and swayed by forces we do not fully understand. Yet the discipline he helped found gradually set aside this psychological richness in favor of the cleaner, simpler, more mathematically convenient rational actor. And it would take nearly 200 years for economics to circle back and rediscover the psychological insight its own founder had understood from the very beginning. It is one of the stranger loops in the history of ideas, a field that began with a deep understanding of human psychological complexity, deliberately simplified that complexity away in pursuit of mathematical elegance, and then, generations later, had to painstakingly rediscover, through careful experiment, what its own founder had grasped intuitively all along. Long before the formal academic study of these ideas, however, history offered vivid, dramatic demonstrations that human beings could behave in ways no rational model could explain, particularly when money and crowds combined. Consider the episode often remembered as tulip mania, which unfolded in the Netherlands in the 1630s. Tulips, recently introduced to Europe from the Ottoman Empire, became fashionable, then desirable, then an object of feverish speculation, with prices for certain rare bulbs climbing to genuinely astonishing heights, reportedly reaching the equivalent value of entire houses for a single bulb at the peak of the frenzy. The details of what actually happened, as far as historians can reconstruct them, are worth dwelling on because they illustrate several of the psychological patterns we discussed earlier, all operating at once. The most prized tulips were those with striking, flame-like patterns of color streaking across their petals, patterns we now know were actually caused by a virus infecting the bulb. Though no one at the time understood this, these rare pattern varieties became the objects of the most intense speculation, and as their prices rose, more and more people, seeing others grow wealthy, rushed to buy, driven by exactly the herd behavior we described earlier, each new buyer pushing prices higher and drawing in the next. A market developed not just in the bulbs themselves, but in contracts to buy bulbs at a future date, allowing speculation to accelerate even during the winter months when the actual bulbs sat dormant underground and could not be inspected or exchanged. People from across Dutch society, not merely wealthy merchants, but ordinary tradespeople, were reportedly drawn into the frenzy, some selling land or businesses to participate, gripped by the powerful expectation that prices would continue rising and that someone else would always be willing to pay even more. And then, as such episodes always do, it collapsed, prices falling almost as suddenly as they had risen, leaving many who had bought at the top holding bulbs, or contracts for bulbs, worth a tiny fraction of what they had paid. The exact scale of the economic damage remains debated among historians, some of whom argue that later accounts exaggerated the mania considerably, and that the actual harm was more contained than legend suggests. But whatever the precise details, which historians still debate, the episode became a lasting symbol of a phenomenon no rational model of markets could easily account for: the capacity of ordinary people, caught up in collective excitement, to pay wildly irrational prices for something, driven not by careful calculation of intrinsic value, but by the simple, powerful expectation that someone else would pay even more tomorrow. A tulip bulb, after all, is a thing that grows a flower. Its value climbed to the price of a house, not because anything about the flower had changed, but because of what was happening inside the minds of the people trading it. A century later, two remarkably similar episodes unfolded almost simultaneously on either side of the English Channel, and both are worth knowing because they involve real, named people whose stories illuminate the psychology at work. In France, a Scottish financier named John Law, whom regular listeners may remember from an earlier evening together, established a scheme built around a company holding trading rights to French territories in North America, and the shares of this company became the object of an enormous speculative frenzy, their price climbing to extraordinary heights before collapsing catastrophically, ruining many and helping to destabilize the French economy for years afterward. Law's story is worth telling in a little more detail because it captures the way psychology and money can intertwine at the very highest levels of a national economy. Law had persuaded the French government to let him establish a bank that issued paper money, a genuinely innovative idea at the time, and to link that bank to his trading company. As enthusiasm for the company's shares grew, Law's bank printed more paper money, some of which flowed into buying yet more shares, pushing prices higher still, in a self-reinforcing spiral that made paper fortunes seem to appear from nowhere. The word millionaire is sometimes said to have entered common usage during this very episode, describing the newly, spectacularly wealthy shareholders created by the frenzy. But the entire structure rested on confidence, on the collective belief that the shares and the paper money were worth what everyone was paying. And when that confidence began to waver, the spiral reversed with terrifying speed. As people rushed to convert their shares and paper money back into gold and silver, the whole edifice collapsed, revealing that the underlying trading company had never generated anything remotely like the wealth its share price had implied. It was, in essence, a vivid demonstration that an entire national economy could be swept up in the same psychological forces that had driven the tulip traders, only now operating at a scale that could destabilize a kingdom. At almost the same time, across the Channel in England, a strikingly similar frenzy formed around the shares of the South Sea Company, in an episode now remembered as the South Sea Bubble. Prices soared on little more than speculative excitement and optimistic rumor, drawing in investors from every level of society, before collapsing spectacularly and wiping out fortunes across the country. And this brings us back to the figure we began with tonight, because among those who lost a great deal of money in the South Sea Bubble was Isaac Newton himself, who is said to have remarked afterward that he could calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people. Whether or not he said those exact words, the sentiment captures something profound and worth pausing on. Even genius offers no protection against the psychological forces that grip us when money and crowds combine. Here, at last, is the fuller story teased at the very start of tonight's journey. Newton had, by some accounts, actually invested early, made a handsome profit, and sold, behaving with apparent wisdom, only to watch the price continue climbing afterward, feel the powerful pull of seeing others still growing rich, buy back in near the peak, and then lose heavily when the bubble finally burst. This is the thing he did, the thing almost every human being does in some smaller way, the thing we promised at the outset to give a name, the discipline to act rationally, overwhelmed by the emotional agony of watching others prosper, followed by a return to the frenzy at exactly the wrong moment. The man who had unlocked the mathematical laws governing the entire physical universe was, in the end, as human as anyone when it came to money and the madness of crowds. These episodes, scattered across the centuries, were treated for a long time as curiosities, as aberrations, as unfortunate outbreaks of collective folly that stood outside the proper, rational functioning of markets, rather than revealing something fundamental about the humans who actually made those markets up. The prevailing view held that these were exceptions, temporary madnesses, and that underneath them, the rational actor still reigned. It would take a very long time for anyone to seriously propose that the irrationality was not the exception at all, but a permanent structural feature of the human mind itself. There were early chroniclers who sensed the deeper truth, even without the tools to prove it. In the middle of the 19th century, a Scottish journalist named Charles Mackay published a book cataloging what he called extraordinary popular delusions and the madness of crowds, gathering together the tulip mania, the South Sea bubble, the Mississippi scheme, and a wide range of other collective manias into a single sweeping account of human folly. Mackay's book became famous and remains widely read to this day, precisely because it captured something people intuitively recognized as true, that human beings, gathered into crowds and gripped by collective excitement, are capable of believing and doing things that no individual, calmly reasoning alone, ever would. Mackay had no theory of cognitive bias, no laboratory experiments, no mathematical model of decision-making. But he had noticed the pattern, and he had seen that it repeated across centuries and across cultures, which is itself the first step of any science. The recognition that something regular and real is happening, waiting to be understood. It would take another century and more before the careful experimental work arrived that could finally explain why these delusions gripped us so reliably. But Mackay had already seen, clearly, that they did. The first serious cracks in the rational actor assumption from within economics itself began to appear in the early 20th century. The economist John Maynard Keynes, writing in the 1930s in the shadow of the Great Depression, argued that markets were driven not purely by rational calculation, but by what he memorably called animal spirits, a spontaneous urge to action rather than inaction, a wave of optimism or pessimism that could sweep through an economy and shape investment, spending, and confidence in ways that pure reason could never fully explain. Keynes understood, from close observation of real markets, that human psychology, mood, confidence, and collective sentiment were not minor footnotes to economic behavior, but central drivers of it. He had, notably, made and lost fortunes as an active investor himself, and this direct personal experience of the markets, of their swings between greed and fear, of the way sentiment could turn on a moment, gave his observations a grounding that purely theoretical economists often lacked. Keynes had felt, in his own investing, the powerful emotional currents he wrote about, and he understood that these currents were not aberrations to be assumed away, but the very substance of what actually moved markets. When he spoke of animal spirits, he was describing something he had witnessed and felt directly, the way a wave of confidence could make investment and enterprise flourish, and the way a wave of fear could freeze economic activity solid, quite apart from any change in the underlying facts of the economy. Keynes offered another striking image that captured the psychological reality of financial markets, comparing the task of successful investing not to carefully judging the true underlying value of a company, but to a peculiar kind of newspaper beauty contest popular in his day, in which readers were asked to pick, from a set of photographs, not the faces they personally found most beautiful, but the faces they thought most other readers would pick. To win such a contest, Keynes observed, you should not choose the faces you find loveliest, nor even the faces you genuinely believe others will find loveliest, but rather try to anticipate what the average opinion expects the average opinion to be, spiraling into layers of guessing about what everyone else is guessing. Financial markets, Keynes argued, often work exactly like this. A great deal of investing is not about judging what a company is truly worth, but about anticipating what other investors will think it is worth, who are themselves trying to anticipate what still others will think, in an endless hall of mirrors driven by collective psychology rather than underlying reality. This was a genuinely important insight, But it remained, for some decades, more of an observation than a rigorous systematic theory, a recognition that psychology mattered without yet a detailed map of exactly how it mattered. Here is where the story takes a genuinely surprising turn, because rather than building on Keynes's psychological insights, mainstream economics through the middle of the 20th century largely moved in the opposite direction, toward an even purer, more mathematically confident version of the rational actor than had ever existed before. In the 1960s and 1970s, an influential body of work developed around what became known as the efficient market hypothesis, associated particularly with the economist Eugene Fama. The core idea held that financial markets are, in an important sense, extremely rational and efficient, because the collective actions of many self-interested, informed participants ensure that all available information is rapidly and accurately reflected in prices. According to this view, it was essentially impossible to consistently beat the market through clever analysis, because any information you might use to identify a mispriced asset would already have been incorporated into its price by the countless other rational participants acting on the same information. This was, in a sense, the high water mark of the rational actor assumption, a beautifully constructed theory holding that markets, in aggregate, were nearly perfectly rational, whatever the occasional irrationality of any individual participant. There was a genuine and subtle insight buried in this idea, worth acknowledging clearly, because the efficient market hypothesis was not simply a mistake to be swept away. Even if every individual participant in a market is biased and irrational, it is at least possible, in principle, that their errors might cancel out in aggregate. Some people, irrationally too optimistic, others, irrationally too pessimistic, leaving the overall market price roughly correct despite the irrationality of everyone in it. And there was, and is, real truth in the observation that markets are genuinely hard to beat, that the collective wisdom of many participants does incorporate an enormous amount of information into prices with remarkable speed, and that most people who believe they can consistently outsmart the market are, in fact, deceiving themselves, which is itself a lesson rooted in the overconfidence bias we have discussed. The behavioral critique did not show that markets were easy to beat or that prices were simply wrong. It showed something more subtle and more interesting, that the errors of individual participants do not always cancel out, that they can instead align and reinforce one another, all the biases pushing in the same direction at the same moment, producing exactly the great bubbles and crashes that a perfectly efficient market should never experience. The efficient market hypothesis was, and in important ways remains, a genuinely powerful and useful idea, and it captured something real about how difficult it truly is to consistently outguess a market full of motivated, informed participants. But it also represented, in retrospect, the assumption of rationality pushed to its furthest extent, and it set the stage for a genuine intellectual collision. On one side stood this elegant, mathematically rigorous vision of rational, efficient markets. On the other side stood the accumulating, undeniable evidence, from tulip bulbs to the South Sea bubble to Isaac Newton's own ruin, that real human beings and the markets they created were capable of profound, systematic, recurring irrationality. This collision between the rational model at its most confident and the psychological reality at its most stubborn set the stage for the revolution that was about to arrive. This is where things began to shift. Again, quietly at first, in the middle of the 20th century, an economist and cognitive scientist named Herbert Simon introduced an idea he called bounded rationality, which represented a subtle but genuinely radical departure from the perfect rationality that economics had long assumed. Simon was a genuinely remarkable figure, a scholar whose curiosity ranged across economics, psychology, computer science, and the study of how organizations actually make decisions, and this breadth gave him a perspective that the more narrowly trained economists of his day often lacked. He was deeply interested in how decisions were made not in the clean world of theory, but in the messy reality of businesses, governments, and individual human minds, all operating under genuine constraints of time, attention, and information. Simon argued that human beings do not actually optimize, carefully calculating the single best possible choice among all available options, because doing so would require more information, more time, and more mental processing power than any real person actually possesses. Think about the sheer impossibility of true optimization even in an ordinary decision, like choosing what to buy at a grocery store. To truly optimize, you would need to consider every single available product, evaluate every possible combination, weigh every price against every measure of quality, against every one of your own preferences, accounting for all the future consequences of each choice. No human being could ever actually do this for even the simplest decision, let alone the genuinely complex financial choices that shape an entire life. And so, Simon observed, we do not. We use rules of thumb. We settle for good enough. We stop searching once we find something acceptable, because that is the only way a finite mind can actually function in an infinitely complex world. Instead, Simon proposed people satisfies a word he coined by blending satisfy and suffice, meaning we search only until we find an option that is good enough, and then we stop rather than exhaustively evaluating every possibility to find the theoretically perfect one. This was a profound reframing. It suggested that human rationality was not simply occasionally corrupted by emotion, but was structurally limited, bounded by the basic realities of a finite mind operating in a complex world with limited time and information. Simon received the Nobel Prize in Economics for this and related work, and his idea of bounded rationality laid important groundwork for everything that followed. But the true revolution, the moment the psychology of money became a rigorous, systematic science, arrived through the work of two psychologists who were not economists at all, and who approached the entire question from a completely different direction. This is where Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky enter the story, and it is worth telling with some care, because their collaboration is one of the most remarkable intellectual partnerships of the 20th century. Kahneman and Tversky were two Israeli psychologists whose personalities and thinking styles were strikingly different. Tversky sharp, confident, and quick. Kahneman more anxious, self-doubting, and endlessly questioning. And yet together, in a partnership of extraordinary closeness and intensity, through the 1970s, they produced a body of work that would ultimately overturn one of the central assumptions of an entire discipline they had never formally studied. What Kahneman and Tversky did, essentially, was to study the systematic ways in which human judgment departs from pure logic and probability, not by philosophizing about it, but by running careful, clever experiments that revealed these departures with precision. They discovered that the human mind relies heavily on mental shortcuts, which they called heuristics, quick, intuitive rules of thumb that usually work well enough, but that lead, in predictable situations, to systematic errors they called biases. They showed that these errors were not random, not the result of stupidity or carelessness, but consistent, patterned features of how normal, intelligent human minds actually work. A few of their specific discoveries are worth understanding because they reveal just how deep and counterintuitive these patterns run. One was what they called the availability heuristic, the tendency to judge how likely or common something is by how easily examples of it come to mind. Because dramatic, vivid, frightening events, a plane crash, a violent crime, are more memorable and more heavily reported than mundane statistical realities. People systematically overestimate the likelihood of the dramatic and underestimate the likelihood of the ordinary, judging risk not by actual frequency, but by ease of recall. This is why many people fear rare but vivid dangers far more than common but quiet ones, a distortion with real consequences for how we assess financial risk, insure against threats, and make decisions under uncertainty. In financial terms, this same heuristic helps explain why a single dramatic, heavily reported market crash can loom so large in the public imagination that it distorts an entire generation's willingness to invest, and why the vivid story of one person's spectacular success or ruin can shape our decisions far more powerfully than the quiet, unremarkable statistical reality of what usually happens. Another was what they called the representativeness heuristic, the tendency to judge how likely something is by how closely it resembles our mental image or stereotype of that kind of thing, rather than by actual statistical probability. This shortcut, useful as it often is, leads to systematic errors, including a failure to account for how common or rare something actually is in the first place. People will judge a detailed, vivid description as more likely to belong to a rare category than a common one, simply because the description matches their stereotype of the rare category, ignoring the basic statistical reality that rare things are, by definition, rare. This same pattern shapes financial judgment in subtle ways, leading people to see meaningful patterns in what is actually random market noise, to believe a run of good or bad luck must reflect some underlying trend, and to mistake a compelling story for a reliable prediction. Another was a startling finding, sometimes illustrated through a puzzle about a fictional woman described as deeply concerned with social justice and discrimination in her youth, and then asking people whether it was more probable that she was a bank teller or that she was a bank teller who was also active in a social movement. A large share of people judged the second, more specific option, more probable than the first, broader one, which is a genuine logical impossibility, since the more specific a description becomes, the less probable it must be, not more, as every additional condition can only narrow the possibilities. The vivid, coherent story the description painted simply overwhelmed the cold logic of probability, causing people to see a more detailed, more plausible-sounding scenario as more likely than a broader one that logically contained it. This finding, sometimes called the conjunction fallacy, revealed just how powerfully a compelling narrative can override basic logical reasoning in the human mind. The lesson reaches far beyond the specific puzzle because it points to something genuinely important about how we think. We are storytelling creatures, drawn irresistibly to coherent, vivid, satisfying narratives, and this pull toward a good story can quietly override the colder, harder logic of probability and evidence. In financial life, this same tendency makes us vulnerable to compelling investment stories, to narratives that feel right and explain everything and paint a vivid picture of a certain future, even when the actual statistical reality is far more uncertain and far less exciting than the story suggests. The more detailed and coherent a financial story becomes, the more convincing it feels, even though, logically, each additional specific detail can only make the whole story less probable, not more. We are, in a sense, built to be persuaded by exactly the kind of rich, specific narrative that should, on cold reflection, make us more cautious rather than less. And perhaps most consequentially, they demonstrated the power of what is called framing, showing that the exact same choice, described in two logically equivalent but differently worded ways, could produce completely opposite decisions. In one famous demonstration, they described a public health situation in terms of how many people would be saved by a given policy, and separately described the identical situation in terms of how many people would die, and found that people made sharply different choices depending purely on which framing they encountered, even though the underlying facts were mathematically identical. Framed as a gain, as lives saved, people tended to avoid risk and choose the certain option. Framed as a loss, as lives lost, the very same people tended to embrace risk to avoid the certain loss, exactly as loss aversion would predict. The words used to describe a choice, it turned out, could reshape the choice itself, even when the underlying reality never changed at all. This finding was genuinely unsettling to economists, and remains so because it strikes at the very foundation of the rational model. If a person prefers one option when it is described in terms of gains, and the opposite option when the identical situation is described in terms of losses, then that person cannot be said to have stable, consistent preferences at all, in the way the rational actor was assumed to. The preference is not a fixed fact about the person, waiting to be revealed by a choice. It is, in part, created in the moment, shaped by the framing, called into being by the particular words used to present the options. This is a profound departure from the tidy assumptions of classical economics, and it has enormous practical consequences, since it means that anyone presenting a choice, whether a doctor describing a treatment, a financial advisor describing an investment, or a store describing a price, is inevitably shaping the decision through the frame they choose, whether they intend to or not, and whether the person deciding is aware of it or not. The partnership that produced these discoveries deserves a moment of its own, because it was genuinely extraordinary. Kahneman and Tversky worked so closely together that they reportedly wrote their papers one sentence at a time, sitting together, arguing over every word, unable afterward to say which ideas had originated with which of them. They spent hours in conversation, laughing, challenging each other, following each other's thoughts. In a collaboration so intimate and so productive, the Kahneman later described it as the great romance of his intellectual life. Their contrasting temperaments, Tversky's sharp confidence and Kahneman's restless self-doubt, seemed to combine into something greater than either could have achieved alone, each supplying exactly what the other lacked. That this partnership, formed between two psychologists studying the quirks of human judgment, would end up reshaping the foundations of economics, a field neither had trained in, is one of the more unlikely and beautiful stories in the history of ideas. The friendship, remarkably, was not to last unbroken. In their later years, as their fame grew and as the recognition for their joint work began to flow, tensions arose between them, strains of the kind that can develop when two people who have shared everything must confront questions of credit, of individual identity, of who contributed what to a body of work they had genuinely created together, sentence by sentence, unable to disentangle their own contributions. There was a period of real distance between them. But before Tversky died, the two men reconciled, and Kahneman has spoken since, with great tenderness and lasting sorrow, of the loss of his friend and collaborator, and of how much of what he achieved was truly theirs together rather than his alone. When Kahneman accepted the Nobel Prize that Tversky did not live to share, he did so by his own account, in the shadow of that absence, honoring a partnership that had been, whatever its later strains, the defining intellectual relationship of his life. There is something deeply human in this coda to their story, a reminder that even the people who mapped the biases and inconsistencies of the human heart were themselves subject to all of it, to pride and rivalry and love and grief, exactly like the rest of us. And crucially, in 1979, they published a paper laying out what they called prospect theory, a rigorous mathematical description of how people actually make decisions involving risk and uncertainty, as opposed to how the rational actor model said they should. Prospect theory captured, among other things, the loss aversion we discussed earlier, the finding that losses loom larger than equivalent gains. It described how people evaluate outcomes not in terms of their final absolute state of wealth, as the rational model assumed, but in terms of gains and losses relative to some reference point, some starting position from which they measure whether they are ahead or behind. And it described how people systematically distort probabilities, overweighting small chances and underweighting near certainties, in particular, predictable ways. This idea of a reference point is worth dwelling on because it quietly overturns one of the deepest assumptions of the rational model. The old model held that a person's satisfaction depended on their total, absolute wealth, how much they had in the end, full stop. Prospect theory revealed that this is not at all how people actually experience their financial lives. Instead, what matters overwhelmingly is change, movement relative to where you started, whether you are gaining or losing from your current reference point. This is why a wealthy person who has just lost a portion of their fortune can feel genuinely miserable, while a far less wealthy person who has just gained a modest sum can feel elated, even though the wealthy person, in absolute terms, still has vastly more. We do not experience our wealth as a fixed total. We experience it as a story of gains and losses, always measured against the point where we happen to be standing. And this single insight explains an enormous amount about why more money so often fails to bring lasting satisfaction, since each new level quickly becomes the new reference point against which future gains and losses are measured, resetting the baseline and leaving us, in a sense, always starting over. The distortion of probabilities that prospect theory described is equally revealing. People, it turns out, do not weigh probabilities in the clean, linear way the rational model assumed. We tend to overweight very small probabilities, which helps explain the enduring appeal of both lottery tickets and insurance, since in both cases we place more weight on a tiny chance of winning or of catastrophe than a coldly rational calculation would justify, and we tend to underweight the difference between merely probable and completely certain, placing an outsized value on absolute certainty, on the elimination of the very last sliver of risk, far beyond what its actual magnitude warrants. These distortions are not random. They are patterned, predictable, and universal, and prospect theory captured them in precise mathematical form for the first time. Prospect theory was, in essence, a detailed, tested, mathematical map of human financial irrationality, and its publication marked the true birth of behavioral economics as a serious scientific field. Kahneman would eventually receive the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002 for this work, a genuinely remarkable honor for a psychologist who had never taken a single economics course, and who received the prize alone only because Tversky, his partner in nearly all of it, had died some years earlier. and the prize is not awarded posthumously, a loss Kahneman spoke of with deep and lasting grief. Let us bring together everything we have gathered so far, the mechanism from earlier and the history we have just walked through, because this is the point where they finally lock together into something you can actually use to make sense of the world and of yourself. Here is the synthesis, the full picture that emerges once all the pieces are finally laid side by side. For most of its history, economics assumed a rational actor who does not exist. The vivid market bubbles of history, from tulips to the South Sea Company, were treated as strange exceptions to this rational rule, rather than clues to a deeper truth. Keynes glimpsed that psychology drove markets, but lacked the tools to map it rigorously. Simon showed that human rationality was structurally bounded, limited by the realities of a finite mind. And then Kahneman and Tversky, working from outside economics entirely, provided the missing map, a precise, tested, experimental account of exactly how and why human judgment departs from pure logic, which Thaler carried into the heart of economics and Shiller carried into the study of markets. What had once looked like scattered exceptions, the occasional madness of crowds, turned out to be the visible surface of a permanent structural feature of the human mind. The same biases operating quietly in every individual decision and erupting at moments of collective excitement into the great bubbles and crashes that punctuate financial history. The exceptions were never exceptions at all. They were the rule, briefly made visible. The insights of Kahneman and Tversky did not stay confined to psychology. They were carried into the heart of economics itself, most importantly, by an economist named Richard Thaler, who encountered their work as a young researcher and found in it the explanation for a whole collection of puzzling behaviors he had been quietly noticing and could not fit into standard economic theory. Thaler had been keeping what he half-jokingly called a list of anomalies, a running collection of ways in which real people behaved that the standard economic model simply could not explain. And in the work of Kahneman and Tversky he found, at last, a framework that could account for them. Thaler became, in effect, the person who translated the psychological insights of Kahneman and Tversky into the language and concerns of economics, and who insisted, against considerable resistance from his own field, that these were not minor curiosities, but central to understanding how real economies actually function. He faced genuine hostility from some quarters of the economics profession, which had invested heavily in the rational actor model and did not welcome the suggestion that its foundations were psychologically unrealistic. And much of Thaler's career became a patient, persistent campaign to demonstrate that human irrationality was too systematic, too predictable, and too consequential to keep excluding from serious economic analysis. Thaler developed and popularized the concept of mental accounting we discussed earlier and explored a wide range of ways in which real economic behavior systematically departs from the rational model. He too would eventually receive a Nobel Prize in 2017, marking how thoroughly the once radical ideas of behavioral economics had, by then, moved from the fringes to the very center of the discipline. Meanwhile, the same insights were reshaping the specific study of financial markets in a field that came to be called behavioral finance. The economist Robert Shiller became one of its most prominent voices, arguing forcefully against the strongest versions of the efficient market hypothesis and demonstrating that financial markets were far more volatile and far more prone to psychologically driven bubbles and crashes than a purely rational model could explain. Shiller argued that markets were subject to what he called, borrowing a memorable phrase, irrational exuberance, waves of collective optimism, that could drive prices far above any reasonable estimate of underlying value, followed by equally psychological collapses. He pointed out that the same herd behavior, the same overconfidence, the same susceptibility to compelling narratives that Kahneman and Tversky had documented in individuals operated at the level of entire markets, producing exactly the kind of bubbles that stretched back through history to the South Sea Company and the Dutch tulip trade. Shiller, too, would receive a Nobel Prize, and in a genuinely revealing illustration of how unsettled these questions remain, he shared it in the very same year with Eugene Fama, the architect of the efficient market hypothesis, whose strongest claims Shiller had spent his career challenging. The prize committee effectively acknowledging that the tension between the rational market and psychological market views had not been fully resolved, but that both had captured something genuinely important about how markets actually work. The bubbles Shiller studied were not confined to distant history. The same psychological patterns that drove the tulip mania and the South Sea bubble reappeared in recognizable form in a series of modern episodes that many listeners will remember or will have heard about. Near the turn of the millennium, a wave of feverish enthusiasm for internet and technology companies drove the prices of such companies to extraordinary heights in what became known as the dot-com bubble, with investors pouring money into businesses that had never earned a profit and in some cases had no realistic path to earning. One, on the strength of little more than optimistic stories about a transformed future. When that enthusiasm broke, prices collapsed, wiping out enormous sums and leaving many investors to wonder how they could have been swept up in something that, in hindsight, looked so obviously unsustainable. The answer, of course, is that they were swept up in exactly the same herd behavior, the same overconfidence, the same seductive narratives, and the same fear of missing out while others grew rich. That had gripped the tulip traders 4 centuries earlier. The technology was new. The psychology was ancient. A few years later, a bubble in housing prices, fueled by a widespread collective belief that home prices could only ever rise, combined with a range of other factors to produce a financial crisis whose consequences spread across the entire global economy. Shiller had, notably, warned about the unsustainable rise in housing prices before the collapse, precisely because his behavioral understanding of markets told him that such psychologically driven booms tend not to continue forever. These modern episodes matter for tonight's story because they demonstrate vividly and recently that the psychological patterns Kahneman, Tversky, Thaler, and Shiller spent their careers documenting are not historical curiosities or laboratory abstractions. They are living forces shaping real markets and real lives in our own time, exactly as they have shaped every speculative frenzy since the first tulip changed hands for the price of a house. There is genuine, ongoing debate among researchers about several aspects of this picture worth being honest about rather than pretending the field is more settled than it truly is. One important development closely associated with Kahneman's later work is the idea that human thinking operates in roughly 2 distinct modes, which he described in a popular book as 2 systems. The first, which he called System 1, is fast, automatic, intuitive, and effortless, the mode that lets you instantly recognize a face, react to a sudden sound, or feel an immediate gut response to a decision. The second, System 2, is slow, deliberate, effortful, and logical, the mode you use to work through a difficult calculation or carefully weigh a complex choice. Kahneman's central argument was that much of our financial and everyday decision-making is governed by the fast, intuitive first system, which is enormously useful, but also the source of most of the systematic biases his work had spent decades documenting, while the slow, careful second system, though capable of catching and correcting these errors, is lazy, easily fatigued, and often simply does not engage when it should. This framework has been enormously influential, though researchers continue to debate exactly how cleanly the mind divides into two such systems, and how literally the metaphor should be taken. What is not in serious doubt is the underlying observation the metaphor captures, that a great deal of our thinking, including much of our financial thinking, happens fast, automatically, and beneath conscious awareness, producing intuitions and gut responses that feel like clear truth, but that are in fact shot through with the systematic biases we have spent this evening tracing. The slow, careful, deliberate mode of thought exists and can catch and correct these errors, but it is effortful and easily bypassed, and much of the time it simply never engages at all, leaving the fast, intuitive system to run the show. This is why so much financial folly feels, in the moment, not like folly at all, but like obvious good sense, since the biased intuition arrives dressed as certainty, and the slow, questioning part of the mind, which might have caught the error, was never even summoned. A second major development took these insights out of the laboratory and into the design of real-world institutions and policies, through an idea that Thaler, working with the legal scholar Cass Sunstein, called the nudge. The core insight is genuinely elegant. Since people do not behave like perfectly rational actors, since we are heavily influenced by defaults, by how choices are framed, by small frictions and conveniences, then the way choices are presented to us, what Thaler and Sunstein called choice architecture, inevitably shapes the decisions we make, whether or not anyone intended it to. A nudge is a deliberate adjustment to this choice architecture, designed to gently steer people toward decisions that are likely to serve their own long-term interests, without forbidding any options or fundamentally changing anyone's incentives. The most celebrated example involves retirement savings, and it connects directly to the present bias we discussed earlier, the deep human tendency to overvalue the present and undersave for the future. Researchers found that when employees had to actively choose to enroll in a retirement savings plan, many, gripped by present bias and the general friction of making an active decision, simply never got around to it and undersaved dramatically as a result. But when the default was reversed, so that employees were automatically enrolled unless they actively chose to opt out, enrollment and savings rates rose dramatically, since the very same human inertia that had kept people out of the plan now kept them in it. Nothing about anyone's freedom to choose had changed. Anyone could still opt out at any time. The only thing that changed was the default, the option that took effect if a person did nothing. And that single change, working with human psychology rather than against it, produced enormous improvements in how much people saved for their own futures. This insight, that the default option exerts a powerful, often decisive influence precisely because of the psychological patterns we have been discussing, has since been applied across an enormous range of domains, from organ donation to public health to energy conservation. The nudge idea has not been without its critics, and the debate around it is worth understanding because it raises genuine questions that have no easy answers. Some have objected that even well-intentioned nudging represents a kind of manipulation, a way of steering people's choices without their full awareness, which sits uncomfortably with the value most societies place on individual autonomy and freedom of choice. If our decisions can be shaped so powerfully by how options are framed and defaulted, the critics ask, then who should hold the power to design those frames and defaults, and toward what ends? A default that steers people toward saving more for retirement seems benign, even beneficial. But the very same techniques could be used to steer people toward choices that serve the interests of whoever designs the choice architecture rather than the interests of the person choosing. Defenders of the approach respond that choice architecture is genuinely unavoidable, that there is no such thing as a neutral way to present a choice, since every menu must be arranged somehow. Every form must have some default, and so the only real question is whether that unavoidable architecture is designed thoughtfully, in people's genuine interest, or carelessly or manipulatively. This is a genuine and unresolved debate, touching on deep questions about freedom, paternalism, and the ethics of understanding human psychology well enough to influence it. And reasonable people continue to disagree about where the proper boundaries lie. But it is genuinely important to be honest about the fact that behavioral economics, for all its influence and insight, has faced real challenges and criticisms in recent years. And a responsible account cannot leave these out. Some specific findings in psychology and behavioral economics, including some that were once widely celebrated, have proven difficult to reproduce reliably in later, larger, more careful studies, part of a broader reckoning across psychology and the social sciences, sometimes called the replication crisis. This does not mean the core insights are wrong, since the most central and most replicated findings, loss aversion, the power of defaults, the reality of many core biases, have held up robustly across enormous bodies of evidence. But it does mean that some individual, more dramatic or more surprising results should be held more tentatively than the confident popular accounts sometimes suggest, and that the field, like any healthy science, is engaged in an ongoing process of testing, questioning, and refining its own claims. Kahneman himself, to his great credit, publicly acknowledged that some of the research he had once relied upon had not held up as well as he had believed, a genuine act of intellectual honesty from one of the field's founding figures, and a reminder that the scientific understanding of human financial psychology, like every other science, remains a living, self-correcting enterprise rather than a finished, settled body of certain truth. A further frontier of this ongoing research has moved, remarkably, inside the brain itself, in a field sometimes called neuroeconomics. Using brain imaging technology, researchers have begun to observe what actually happens in the brain as people make financial decisions, and the findings have added a striking physical dimension to the psychological patterns we have been discussing all evening. Studies have found, for instance, that the anticipation of financial gain activates some of the same brain regions associated with other pleasures and rewards, while the prospect of financial loss activates regions associated with fear and pain, giving a literal physical grounding to the loss aversion Kahneman and Tversky first measured through behavior alone. Researchers have watched the emotional, fast-reacting parts of the brain light up during moments of financial temptation or panic, sometimes overriding the slower, more deliberate regions associated with careful reasoning, offering a physical glimpse of exactly the tension between Kahneman's two systems. This research remains young, and its findings must be interpreted with genuine caution, since the brain is extraordinarily complex and imaging technology reveals only a coarse picture of what is actually happening. But it represents a genuinely fascinating convergence. The ancient question of how the human mind meets money now being pursued not only through clever behavioral experiments, but through direct observation of the living brain itself, weighing, fearing, and deciding in real time. So what does all of this mean for us? Not for researchers running experiments and winning prizes, but for the quiet daily life that most of us are actually living, lying here in the dark, thinking about our own money, our own choices, our own small regrets and justifications, rather than a laboratory or a lecture hall? There is a natural question that tends to surface right about now, lying here, having walked through 400 years of tulip traders, ruined geniuses, and two psychologists patiently mapping the hidden machinery of the mind. If these biases are this universal, this deep, and this impossible to simply switch off, what use is any of this knowledge at all? The answer is quieter than it might first appear, and it begins with a single, valuable shift in self-understanding. Consider how many of these patterns quietly shape an ordinary financial life once you know to look for them. The overconfidence that leads many people to believe they can consistently pick winning investments or time the market's ups and downs, despite overwhelming evidence that even most professionals cannot, is a well-documented bias, and one that costs ordinary investors dearly, as they trade too often, take on too much risk, and underperform the very markets they were trying to beat. The loss aversion that makes people check their investments obsessively during a downturn, feeling each dip is a fresh wound, and that tempts them to sell in panic at exactly the wrong moment. Locking in losses that patients would have healed is the same loss aversion Kahneman and Tversky first measured in a laboratory decades ago. The mental accounting that leads people to keep money in a low-interest savings account while simultaneously carrying high-interest debt, treating the two as belonging to separate mental worlds when a rational actor would simply use one to pay off the other, is the same mental accounting Thaler spent his career documenting. The present bias that makes saving for a distant retirement feel like a genuine sacrifice, a gift handed to a future self who barely feels real, is the same present bias woven into the deep architecture of the human relationship to time. The anchoring that makes a marked down price feel like a bargain. That lets a suggested retail price quietly reshape our sense of what a thing is worth, works on us every time we shop, usually without our noticing. And the herd behavior that draws us toward whatever investment everyone is excited about, precisely when that excitement has pushed its price to its most dangerous heights, is the same herd instinct that drove the tulip traders and ruined Isaac Newton. These are not exotic laboratory findings. They are the quiet, constant companions of an ordinary financial life, shaping decisions large and small every day in every one of us. There is one more bias worth naming here directly, because it is perhaps the most quietly costly of all in ordinary financial life: overconfidence. Human beings, across a wide range of studies, tend to overestimate their own abilities, their own knowledge, and the accuracy of their own predictions. And this is nowhere more consequential than in the handling of money. Most people believe they are above-average drivers, which is statistically impossible. And a similar overconfidence pervades our financial self-assessment. Investors consistently believe they can identify winning investments and anticipate the market's movements, despite overwhelming evidence that even highly trained, full-time professionals struggle enormously to do either with any consistency. This overconfidence leads people to trade more frequently than they should, incurring costs and taxes with each transaction, to concentrate their money in too few investments, believing they have identified a sure thing, and to take on risks they do not fully understand, confident in a mastery they do not actually possess. The overconfidence is not a sign of unusual arrogance. It is a nearly universal feature of the human mind, the same feature that lets us function with confidence in an uncertain world, turned, in the domain of money, into a quiet and persistent source of costly error. None of this knowledge makes you immune, but it does mean that when you feel the panic of a market dip, or the seductive certainty that this particular investment cannot lose, or the strange comfort of spending money that felt somehow free, you can recognize the pattern for what it is, an ancient instinct firing in a modern context, rather than mistaking it for clear-eyed truth. And recognizing the pattern, even when you cannot switch it off, changes your relationship to it. You can build in a pause. You can wait a day before deciding. You can set up automatic systems that make the wise choice the default choice, so that you do not have to win the same internal battle over and over again. This is not a strategy, and it is certainly not advice about what specifically to do with your own money. It is simply a clearer view of the mind that has to make those decisions, which is, in its own quiet way, one of the most useful things a person can ever come to possess. So what do we do with all of this? Let us start by dismantling a few myths, gently, now that we have the full picture in front of us. The first myth is that being irrational about money is a personal failing, a sign that you specifically are bad with money, undisciplined, or foolish in some way that other, better people are not. What the entire history we trace tonight demonstrates is the opposite. These biases, loss aversion, mental accounting, anchoring, and all the rest are not personal weaknesses. They are universal features of the human mind, present in geniuses and ordinary people alike, in trained economists and complete novices, in the wealthy and the struggling. Isaac Newton was not stupid, and he still lost a fortune to the madness of a speculative bubble. The biases we have discussed are, in a real sense, part of the standard equipment of being human, shaped over a very long evolutionary history, and recognizing them in yourself is not a confession of weakness, but simply an accurate description of the mind you and everyone else happens to have. This point about evolution is worth dwelling on because it reframes these biases not as flaws or malfunctions, but as features, quirks that made a great deal of sense in the environment where the human mind actually took shape. Consider loss aversion, the finding that losses hurt roughly twice as much as equivalent gains feel good. For our distant ancestors, living close to the margin of survival, this asymmetry was not irrational at all. A loss of food, of shelter, of status could mean death, while an equivalent gain, though welcome, was rarely as consequential. A mind that treated losses as roughly twice as important as gains was, in that environment, a mind well tuned for survival, quick to protect against threats that could prove fatal. The trouble is that this same finely tuned instinct, transplanted into the modern world of investments, retirement accounts, and financial markets, produces systematic errors, causing us to hold losing investments too long and to fear market downturns with an intensity out of all proportion to their actual stakes. The bias is not a malfunction. It is an ancient survival tool operating in an environment it was never designed for. The same evolutionary logic applies to present bias, our tendency to overvalue immediate rewards over future ones. For most of human history, the future was radically uncertain, and a reward available now was genuinely worth more than a promised reward later that might never actually arrive. A mind that grabbed the sure thing in front of it, rather than gambling on an uncertain future, was often a mind that survived. Only in the modern world, with its stable institutions, its retirement accounts, and its reasonable expectation that we will live to enjoy the fruits of long-term saving, does this deep instinct become a genuine handicap. Again and again, the biases we have discussed turn out to be not random defects, but the residue of a mind exquisitely adapted to a world very different from the one we now inhabit, which is precisely why they are so universal, so deeply rooted, and so impossible to simply think our way out of. The second myth is that once you understand these biases, you can simply overcome them through knowledge and willpower, thinking your way clear of the traps. This turns out to be far less true than we might hope, and it is one of the more humbling findings in the entire field. Even Kahneman himself, who spent his entire career studying these biases in exhaustive detail, freely admitted that understanding them intellectually gave him almost no immunity to actually falling for them in his own life. The biases operate in the fast, automatic first system, the one that runs beneath conscious awareness and produces its judgments before the slow, deliberate second system ever has a chance to intervene. Knowing about an optical illusion does not make you stop seeing it, and knowing about a cognitive bias, in much the same way, does not make you stop feeling its pull. What understanding these biases can do, more modestly but still valuably, is help you recognize the situations in which they are likely to lead you astray, and build external structures, defaults, rules, cooling-off periods, trusted advisors that protect you from your own predictable tendencies, rather than relying on willpower alone to resist forces that operate beneath the reach of will. This is genuinely the key practical insight of the entire field, and it is worth stating plainly, because the biases operate automatically and beneath awareness. The most effective response is not to try harder to be rational in the moment, which rarely works, but to arrange your circumstances in advance so that the biased, in-the-moment decision is taken out of your hands, or at least slowed down. This is why an automatic savings arrangement, which quietly moves money aside before you ever see it and feel the pull to spend it, works so much better than a resolution to save whatever is left over at the end of the month, which pits your good intentions against present bias every single day, and usually loses. It is why building in a waiting period before any large purchase, giving the slow, deliberate mind time to catch up with the fast, impulsive one, protects against so many regretted decisions. The wisdom here is not to fight your own psychology head-on, which is a battle the fast, automatic system usually wins, but to work around it, designing your own small systems and defaults that make the wiser choice the easier one, so that you do not have to summon heroic willpower at the very moment you are least able to. The third myth, and perhaps the one most worth sitting with, is the fear that if human beings are this systematically irrational, then we are essentially helpless, at the mercy of forces we cannot see and cannot control, doomed to make the same mistakes forever. The story we trace tonight suggests something more hopeful. The entire arc of this history is the story of human beings gradually coming to understand their own minds more clearly, and using that understanding to build better tools, better institutions, better defaults that work with human psychology rather than against it. The automatic retirement enrollment we discussed is a perfect example. Rather than lecturing people to be more rational, which does not work, researchers designed a system that quietly helps people save more by working with the grain of human inertia, rather than fighting it. Understanding our irrationality does not leave us helpless. It gives us, for the first time, the possibility of designing a world that accounts honestly for the minds we actually have, rather than the perfectly rational minds we always pretended to possess. And there is a deeper consolation still, worth holding on to. The very same features of the human mind that produce our financial biases are inseparable from the features that make us human in the fullest and best sense. The mind that fears loss more than it values gain is the same mind that treasures what it has, that forms deep attachments, that grieves. The mind that overvalues the vivid present is the same mind that can be fully, joyfully alive in a single moment. The mind that is swept up by compelling stories is the same mind that can be moved by art, by meaning, by hope. We could not simply excise the biases without excising much of what makes us who we are, since they are not a separate, faulty module bolted onto an otherwise rational machine, but woven into the very fabric of a feeling, remembering, story-loving, deeply social creature. To understand the psychology of money is, in the end, not to discover that we are broken, but to appreciate with a kind of tenderness the beautiful and complicated minds we actually carry through the world. So what do we do with all of this? In practical terms, the answer, and this might be the least satisfying part of everything we have explored tonight, is that there is no single answer. The economy is not a machine you can tune with a screwdriver. It is billions of people making decisions every day, and the patterns that emerge are real, but not fully controllable. What we have done tonight is not give you a strategy. It is give you the words, the framework, the understanding you need to make sense of the headlines, to ask better questions, and to sit with uncertainty without it turning into fear. For the rest, the decisions about what to do with your own resources, that is between you and your own judgment, ideally informed by professionals who understand your specific situation. What we have done tonight is give you something quieter, but maybe more lasting, the ability to see the system clearly and to see yourself a little more clearly too. And sometimes that is enough. There is one more reflection worth offering before we let the mind begin to settle toward sleep, and it concerns the relationship between understanding these patterns and being kind to yourself. A great deal of the distress people carry about money is not really about the money itself, but about a quiet, nagging sense of personal failure, the feeling that a truly capable, disciplined, sensible person would not make the mistakes we make, would not feel the pulls we feel, would somehow be above all this. What the entire history we trace tonight offers, more than any specific technique or strategy, is release from that particular burden. The mistakes are not yours alone. They are not a mark against your character or your intelligence. They belong to all of us, to the whole human species, written into the deep architecture of a mind that evolved for a world very different from the one we now navigate. Isaac Newton felt these pulls. Kahneman, who understood them better than anyone alive, felt them too. There is a genuine and lasting comfort in that knowledge, the comfort of realizing that you are not uniquely flawed, but simply, unavoidably human, sharing in the common inheritance of a mind that was never designed for spreadsheets and retirement accounts, and that does its imperfect best anyway. There is a quiet, human thread running underneath everything we have covered tonight, worth pulling into the light before we let this rest. From the Dutch tulip traders of the 1630s, to Isaac Newton ruined by the South Sea bubble, to Keynes watching animal spirits sweep through markets, to two Israeli psychologists in the 1970s patiently mapping the hidden architecture of human judgment, the story of the psychology of money is really the story of humanity, slowly, reluctantly coming to understand itself, coming to see that the mind that earns and spends and saves and fears is not a cold, calculating machine, but a warm, biased, beautifully imperfect human thing. It is worth remembering, too, that almost none of the people at the center of this history set out to overturn a discipline or reshape how the world understood itself. Herbert Simon was simply trying to describe how people actually make decisions. Given the limits of a real mind, Kahneman and Tversky were simply two friends, delighting in each other's company, chasing down puzzles about human judgment because they found them genuinely fascinating, With no particular ambition to storm the citadel of economics, Thaler was simply keeping a list of things that did not make sense to him, unable to let the anomalies go. None of them set out to prove that human beings are irrational. They set out, more modestly, to understand, with honesty and precision, how the human mind actually works. And in doing so, they gradually dismantled an assumption so old and so deeply embedded that almost no one had thought to question it. The revolution they created was, in the end, an act of intellectual honesty, a refusal to keep pretending that people behaved in ways they demonstrably did not. And there is something genuinely consoling in where this history leaves us. For centuries, the official story of economics held that the ideal human being was a perfect calculating machine, and that our emotions, our inconsistencies, our susceptibility to stories and crowds and fears were flaws to be overcome, embarrassing departures from an idealized rationality. What the psychology of money ultimately revealed is that these supposed flaws are simply what it means to be human. That the same mind that falls for a bargain or panics in a downturn is the same mind that loves, hopes, remembers, and dreams, running on the same ancient machinery, shaped by the same long history. To understand the psychology of money is, in the end, to understand something tender and true about ourselves, not that we are broken versions of some perfect rational ideal, but that we are exactly, fully, and unavoidably human in our finances as in everything else. You are lying there now, in the dark, perhaps thinking faintly of that small purchase, that quiet regret, that story you told yourself afterward. And perhaps, now, that small moment looks a little different than it did an hour ago. Not a lapse, not a failure, just the quiet, ordinary working of a human mind, doing exactly what human minds have always done, reaching for the vivid present, feeling the pull of a story, weighing a gain against a loss, on scales tilted long before you were born. There is nothing to fix in that moment, and nothing to be ashamed of. There is only something to understand, and in understanding it, to hold a little more gently. The next time you feel the pull of a bargain, or the sting of a loss, or the strange comfort of spending money that felt somehow free, you will know, at least a little, what is happening underneath. Not because you can switch these forces off, since no one can, but because seeing a thing clearly changes your relationship to it, even when you cannot change the thing itself. There is a strange peace in that, in recognizing the pattern, even the pattern running quietly through your own mind. The economy is not a natural disaster happening to you. It is a human creation, shaped by human choices, made across centuries by minds exactly like yours, with all the same beautiful imperfections. And we are inside it, all of us, together, still learning, generation after generation, how the human mind actually meets the strange invention we call money. And as you lie there, the world continues to turn. Somewhere, a market is rising on hope and falling on fear, exactly as it has for 400 years. Somewhere, a person is telling themselves a small story about a purchase, just as you have, just as everyone has. Somewhere, a researcher is running one more careful experiment, adding one more small piece to our slowly growing understanding of the oldest and most familiar mystery of all, the human mind itself. And here, in the dark, none of it needs your attention. Not tonight. The markets will rise and fall without you. The old instincts will keep firing, in every mind, in every age, as they always have. And you can simply rest, knowing a little more than you did, and needing to do nothing at all with that knowledge right now. It simply is, as it always has been, as it will be tomorrow.